On my 74th birthday, my daughter slapped me in front of 50 people and screamed I had betrayed her father. I stood there holding the gift I had spent weeks preparing for her, his letters from the day she was born. I left the party in silence, but deep down I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far more powerful. I woke up early that morning, the same way I always do. The sun hadn't fully crept over the ridge yet, and the house was quiet. Too quiet. No phone call, no voicemail, just a short text from Alyssa. It said, "Be ready by 9 Sazuri. There's a surprise, no happy birthday, not even a heart." I boiled water and dropped a chamomile tea bag into my favorite mug. It had a small crack along the rim, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it out. Walter bought it for me our first year in Colorado. He used to make me breakfast on my birthday. Eggs over easy toast. A single candle in a muffin. He's been gone 4 years now, but on days like this, I swear I can still hear the sound of his slippers shuffling into the kitchen. I sat down by the window with my tea and watched the wind move through the pines. The stillness of the house wasn't peaceful. It felt hollow, like waiting for a knock that never comes. On the table in front of me was a small box wrapped in brown paper. Inside it was a bundle of letters. Walter had written them the week Alyssa was born. He never gave them to her, said he would one day when she was ready. After he passed, I found them tucked in the back of his sock drawer, each one dated and sealed. I had been saving them. Today, I was going to give her that gift. I tied the box with a pale ribbon, hands shaking more than they used to. It wasn't just the arthritis. I was nervous. I didn't know how she'd react. Lately, everything between us felt formal, like we were both acting in a scene trying to remember our lines. By 8:30, I had dressed in a soft navy sweater and simple slacks. My hair was pulled back. No lipstick, just a little powder. The car was supposed to come at 9, so I waited by the front door, and I kept glancing at the letters, wondering if I was doing the right thing. Have you ever held something so personal in your hands, knowing it could heal a wound or reopen it? That was me right then. Just me. A cracked mug, a gift of memories, and a silence that was about to be broken. At exactly 9, a sleek black sedan pulled into my driveway. I didn't recognize the driver. He stepped out, nodded politely, opened the back door, and stood waiting. No small talk, no birthday wishes, just a gesture as if I were being summoned rather than invited. The ride into town was quiet. I kept the small box of letters on my lap. My hands rested over it the entire time. I looked out the window at the mountains still capped with spring snow. My stomach felt tight. Something about this didn't feel like a celebration. It felt orchestrated. We pulled up to Alyssa's house. It wasn't a home, not anymore. It was a 3-story glass box she called her live workspace perched above the river. Clean lines, cold surfaces, modern art that didn't say anything. The yard was lined with hired staff in all black directing guests and managing valet service. I stepped out unsure if I was underdressed. A woman with a headset checked a clipboard and nodded toward the door. Inside, I was greeted with a blast of artificial warmth. The lights were bright, the music upbeat. Every corner of the space was decorated in lavender and silver, but none of it felt personal. It was like walking into a product launch. I scanned the room for familiar faces. None. These weren't my friends, not even Alyssa's childhood ones. Just well-dressed strangers holding champagne flutes and talking about IPOs and marketing campaigns. One woman asked me if I was the interior consultant. Another asked where the restroom was. Then I saw Alyssa standing beneath a silver archway surrounded by photographers. She wore a fitted cream suit, hair slicked back, every movement calculated. She looked powerful, but not warm. She caught sight of me and waved just a flick of her hand. Then she turned back to her guests. No hug, no smile, no birthday greeting. I stood there unsure of where to go. A young man handed me a flute of sparkling water and gestured toward a small lounge in the back. I made my way there, clutching the box of letters. The lounge had a fireplace, but it wasn't lit, just a decorative screen with electric embers. I sat alone, watching the crowd. My birthday had been turned into a networking event. I wasn't the guest of honor. I wasn't even a guest. I looked down at the box in my lap. The ribbon had loosened slightly. I fixed it, smoothing it with care. I had imagined giving this to Alyssa in a quiet moment, maybe over tea, but there would be no quiet moment here. She was using my birthday as a stage, and I was just a prop. I stayed seated, quiet. I didn't want to draw attention. But something shifted in me. I wasn't hurt. Not yet. But I was no longer unsure. I had come here thinking today was about something tender. It wasn't. It was a presentation. And somewhere in this crowd of polished strangers, I knew something else was coming. Something not on the program, something meant to unsettle. I just didn't know yet who the audience would really be. Gregory arrived just as the speeches were winding down. I saw him through the glass entry wearing a simple gray coat and holding a dark velvet box in both hands. His movements were slower than I remembered, but his eyes searched the crowd with quiet urgency. When our eyes met, he gave a small nod. That alone told me this wasn't a casual visit. He made his way through the crowd, ignored by most. One or two guests glanced at him, puzzled, unsure whether he belonged. He didn't try to explain. He didn't need to. He walked straight toward me. Gregory hadn't changed much. Still tall, still calm, still carrying something unspoken in the corners of his mouth. But this time I saw something else wait. Not physical, but emotional. His shoulders carried it. He stopped in front of me, looked around, then gently placed the velvet box on the small coffee table beside my untouched flute of sparkling water. His hands lingered on the lid. He said only one thing, "It's time." I didn't touch it. I looked at him instead. "You know what this is," he said. "Walter asked me to bring it to you today." I stared at the box. My husband had spoken of a private letter before he passed, but never mentioned anything about an actual object. Certainly nothing that would arrive in front of 100 strangers. Gregory lowered his voice. "Only you can open it. That's what he wanted." Before I could respond, Alyssa appeared. She had crossed the room quietly, and now stood between me and Gregory. Her eyes flicked to the box, her mouth tightened. "What's this?" she said flatly, her tone low but firm. Gregory straightened. "Something your father left for your mother. It was to be delivered today." Alyssa's gaze shifted to me, then back to the box. She stepped forward and reached for it. Gregory moved his hand, slightly blocking her. Only Marjorie, her jaw clenched. "So we're doing this here now, in front of everyone." She turned and gestured. A small group nearby turned their heads. A photographer with a long lens stepped closer. I sat perfectly still. The room grew quieter. One by one, heads turned toward us. The velvet box between us became the center of gravity. Alyssa didn't hesitate. She raised her voice, not enough to shout, but enough to cut through the music. "My mother had an affair," she said. There was no warning, just the words dropped like cold stones. With him, she added, pointing directly at Gregory. Gasps spread like ripples. Glasses froze mid-air. A woman near the bar whispered to her companion. "I didn't move. Neither did Gregory. She doesn't deserve to open that box." Alyssa continued. "She disgraced my father. She kept it secret all these years, and now she wants the last word." Then without another second's pause, Alyssa raised her hand and slapped me. Not hard, not violent, but sharp enough to echo. A beat of silence followed. Then more whispers. No one intervened. No one asked if I was all right. I didn't touch my cheek. I looked straight at her. Gregory took one step back. The box remained untouched. Without a word, I stood, leaving the box where it was. I didn't flinch. I didn't explain. I walked out of the room, past the glass doors, past the valet, and onto the sidewalk. The air outside was cool and dry. I kept walking. Inside, the party continued, but something had shifted. I didn't know yet what was in that box, but I knew now exactly what had been taken from me, and I intended to get it back. The moment her hand struck my cheek, the entire room froze. The clink of champagne glasses stopped mid-air. Even the music, already low, seemed to vanish altogether. I felt the heat rise where her palm had landed, but I didn't lift my hand to touch it. I stood there, letting the silence soak in. Alyssa stepped back, her chest rising with shallow breaths. Her voice cut through the quiet, like glass cracking. She said I had betrayed our family. She said I had an affair with Gregory when Walter was alive. And she said that whatever was in that box should never belong to someone who had disgraced her father. No one asked for proof. No one asked what really happened. Heads turned. A few guests whispered. Some stared at their drinks. Others just stared at me like I was the villain in a story they had only just started to hear. Gregory looked stunned, his eyes searching mine. He took a step forward, maybe to speak, but I raised a hand slightly. He understood and stopped. I didn't say a word. I didn't scream. I didn't defend myself. I simply turned toward the nearest door heels, clicking softly on the polished floor, and walked out into the chilly evening air. Outside, the wind tugged at the edges of my coat. I paused at the sidewalk. A couple strolled by, laughing, unaware that just a few feet away, someone's entire sense of dignity had been shattered in front of a room full of polished strangers. I didn't cry. I thought I might. But what I felt wasn't sadness. It wasn't even anger. It was clarity. Cold, sharp clarity. I began walking, not toward the car that had brought me, but away from the house, away from the cameras and curated smiles, away from the daughter who no longer saw me as a mother, only as a barrier to something she believed she deserved. I remembered how Alyssa had clung to me at Walter's funeral, how she had whispered that we were all each other had left. I believed her. I had believed every tear that fell on my shoulder that day. And now I couldn't remember the last time she looked at me without calculation in her eyes. By the time I reached the end of the block, my face had gone numb from the cold, or maybe from everything else. I stopped at a bench near a park where Walter used to take Alyssa as a child. I sat down. The cold metal seeped through my coat, grounding me in the moment. People always think betrayal is loud, that it comes with shouting or doors slamming. But sometimes betrayal is a soft accusation wrapped in a smile. Sometimes it's a slap in front of people who smile politely while they judge you silently. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up with a blanket over my knees, a cup of tea long gone cold, and Walter's old photo in my lap. Something had been taken from me in that room. Not money, not inheritance, something deeper. And I knew then I had a choice. I could let it sink me, or I could use the pain as fuel. I wasn't sure how yet, but I would find the truth. And I would take back what was mine. Not the box, not the money, my name, my dignity, my voice. And I would do it without raising my voice. Just like Walter would have, just like a mother who once taught her daughter how to stand tall without shouting. That night, after I returned home, I didn't take off my coat. I sat in the armchair by the fireplace, letting the silence press down around me. On the coffee table lay the small box I had intended to give Alyssa earlier that day. I never even got the chance. I reached for the phone and dialed the only person Walter ever trusted with legal matters, Delaney Carmichael. It had been years since we last spoke, but her voice was the same, measured, precise, the kind of voice that always felt like the room around it was made of oak and leather. She remembered Walter immediately, and me. When I told her what happened at the party, she paused for a long moment. Then she asked if I had a few minutes to come by her office the next morning. There was something she had been waiting to share, something Walter had left behind, meant to be revealed only when I turned 74. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat upright, listening to the wind press against the windows. My thoughts scattered like dry leaves across the years. Had Walter seen this coming? Had he known what Alyssa would become, or had he simply prepared for everything the way he always did? The next morning, I arrived at Delaine's office just as the fog was starting to lift from the sidewalks. Her space looked exactly as I remembered it. Shelves of thick law books, neat folders, and a framed black and white photo of her with Walter taken the year he retired. Delaney didn't waste time. She handed me a sealed envelope first marked in Walter's handwriting. Underneath it, a second envelope, then a third, each one labeled clearly for Marjorie, for the lawyer, for the boxkeeper. Delaney explained that Walter had anticipated interference. He didn't know what shape it would take, only that he feared Alyssa might try to manipulate things. He had created multiple layers of protection. The first envelope was for me, a letter handwritten dated 3 months before he passed. In it, Walter told me he had arranged for Gregory to deliver the box on my 74th birthday. Not earlier, not later. The contents he wrote were meant for my eyes only. No one else's judgment mattered. The second envelope contained instructions to Delaney. If anything irregular happened, if Alyssa interfered or made accusations, Delaney was authorized to act on my behalf. Walter had signed the papers, notarized them, and added a clause. Under no circumstances was Alyssa to gain control over any portion of the estate unless she honored the timeline and the original intention of the gift. The third envelope, I would learn later, was the most powerful. It was to be handed to Gregory in case he ever felt pressure or threats from Alyssa. It outlined his role as a formal custodian, not just a friend carrying a box. He was protected legally with specific wording making the transfer of the box a binding act under Walter's last wishes. Delaney looked at me after I read everything. Her expression was calm, but her eyes told me something else. She had expected this moment, and she had waited for me to be ready. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant either. What I felt was something colder but sharper, like a key fitting into a lock after years of silence. Walter had known. He had seen the way Alyssa had changed, seen what I didn't want to admit, and now he had given me back a voice. Not to shout, not to accuse, but to act carefully, precisely, and above all, wisely. I folded the letters back into their envelopes. When I left Elaine's office, the sun had broken through the clouds. It didn't warm me, but it lit the path ahead just enough. I wasn't walking away anymore. I was walking towards something. Delaney handed me the last file before she walked out of the room to take a call. I sat alone in her office, watching the soft light reflect off the glass-top desk. In front of me were pages yellowed at the edges, Walter's handwriting neat and deliberate. My hands trembled, but I unfolded the letter anyway. Marguerite, it began. If you're reading this, it means my prediction was correct. He had seen it far before I ever allowed myself to. He wrote of the growing distance between Alyssa and him, the times she questioned every decision he made, about the trust, about the family home, about my involvement in anything financial. He wrote about the coldness that crept into her voice when she talked about legacy, the way she spoke of me in clinical terms, as if I were a figure to be managed, not a person to be honored. He had known. Walter explained that he had spent the last 2 years of his life quietly documenting everything. He had witnessed Alyssa attempting to forge his signature once on a financial document linked to an investment fund in his name. She never succeeded, but it had been enough for him to act. He had created 2 layers of protection. The first was what Delaney had already shown me, the legal framework that ensured Alyssa couldn't touch the core assets of his estate unless she followed certain ethical boundaries. The second was the box Gregory carried. Inside it, he said, was more than sentiment. There was a second will, one written after the incident with the forged document. It didn't remove Alyssa entirely, but it shifted control. It placed the legacy in my hands, not just as widow, but as steward. The steward of a story that deserved to be told with dignity. He knew I would hesitate. He knew I would want to protect her even now. That was why he made Gregory the bridge. Gregory would confirm what I read. Delaney would secure it, and I was to decide how it would be made public, if at all. I looked up, breathing slowly. For a long time, I had convinced myself I was just old-fashioned, too sentimental, too soft. I had clung to the image of Alyssa as the girl who once baked me a lopsided birthday cake. But Walter saw what I couldn't. He never blamed me, not once, in that letter. He simply asked one thing, that I not let silence win. Delaney returned, her face composed. She placed a second folder in front of me. This one held documentation verifying Gregory's legal role as boxkeeper. Not just a friend, but an authorized executive of Walter's final act. I nodded slowly. The shape of it all began to settle in my mind. This wasn't about money. It wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration of voice of truth, of the kind of legacy that couldn't be manipulated by image or brand deals or polite headlines. I thanked Delaney quietly before I left. She reminded me that everything was still in my hands. Nothing had to happen overnight. I could take time. I could choose the moment. I could decide how loudly or how softly this truth would be spoken that night. I didn't sit in silence. I brewed 2 cups of tea, one for me and one for the man who had known me better than I had ever known myself. Walter had laid the groundwork. Now it was my turn to walk the rest of the path. I waited 3 days, not because I was afraid, but because I needed to be ready. I wanted every piece of this next moment to be intentional. When I finally called Elisa, I kept my tone light. I said I missed her. I said I wanted to talk just the 2 of us. No tension, no drama. She hesitated for a second, then responded as if nothing had happened. Her voice was sweet, measured. She suggested we meet for brunch at the Garden Cafe near the lake, the one with white row-iron chairs and lemon cake she used to love. I agreed. That morning, I wore the simple gray coat Walter once called my armor. Inside my purse, tucked in a silk pouch, was a tiny digital recorder, just one button. I had tested it twice clear enough to catch every word, even over clinking plates and the buzz of soft jazz. When I arrived, she was already seated wearing a pale green dress, hair swept neatly back. Her posture perfect, just like the image she cultivated online. We greeted like mother and daughter should. She kissed my cheek, she commented on my hair, then she ordered champagne for both of us. I declined mine. She smiled like it didn't matter. For a while, we talked about safe things, how the weather had turned, how her work with the foundation was expanding. I let her lead. I let her feel in control. Then came the shift. Her eyes grew sharper, her voice quieter. She reached across the table, rested her hand on mine. She said the words as if they were nothing. If you would be willing to let go of the estate's administrative responsibilities, it might be smoother for everyone, less confusion, less exposure. I didn't flinch. I let her continue. She mentioned media plans, legacy branding, the importance of preserving our family's image in a way that was palatable to modern audiences. She spoke like I was a liability to be managed. I only nodded. She never asked what I wanted, never wondered how I felt about being erased from my husband's legacy. To her, this was just another transaction, a tidying up of loose ends. I watched her speak, noting each word, each calculated pause. She called it unity. She meant control. When the waiter brought the check, she reached for it with a smile. I insisted on paying. She laughed like it was charming. I reached into my bag, pressed stop on the recorder beneath the folds of my scarf. I stood, said goodbye, with warmth, told her I was proud of how composed she'd been lately. Her smile faltered just for a second. She didn't know she had just given me everything I needed. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with Delaney. I played the recording once then, twice. We took notes, time-stamped every key phrase. Delaney's face was unreadable, but her fingers tapped rhythmically on the legal pad. It was more than enough, more than a slip. It was an admission framed in polite language, cloaked in concern, but damning in its clarity. Delaney nodded once firmly. We were ready for the next step. Not retaliation, not exposure for the sake of revenge, but clarity on record undeniable. Walter's trust in me, in all his preparations, had not been misplaced. I had found my footing, and I would use it. The next morning, Delaney called me early. Her voice was steady but alert. She had gone over the recording 3 times and sent a copy to her legal associate, specializing in probate and estate disputes. She said what I already suspected. This was enough. Enough to raise questions in court. Enough to argue manipulation, coercion, even fraud if we needed to. But Delaney had a different plan. She didn't want this to spiral into a media spectacle or a dragged-out court battle. She suggested we take a quieter, more strategic route, a kind of preemptive clarity. I listened closely as she laid it out. We would create a public F-facing legacy initiative based on Walter's original intentions. Not just a trust fund, not just an estate, something real, a foundation named after both of us, centered on the exact values Alyssa had tried to erase. It would be called the Walter and Marjorie Trust for Women in Later Life. It would provide legal assistance, financial planning, and transitional housing for older women displaced by family or financial abuse, the same kind of displacement I had almost experienced. I sat in silence after she finished explaining. Then I nodded. It was perfect, and it would be irreversible. We drafted the charter within 3 days. Gregory signed on as a legacy ambassador. Delaney filed the paperwork. I made the first donation pulling directly from my half of the investments Walter left behind. Then came the question of timing. Alyssa had been planning another event, a supposed legacy dinner, where she would finally return the box. It was meant to appear as a reconciliatory gesture framed by cameras and curated guests. She thought it would win back public trust after the whispers that followed her outburst, but she didn't know I already had the real story. Delaney smiled when I told her. She said, "Then that's our moment." So we built toward it quietly. No press leaks, No confrontation, just preparation. I wrote my own statement. It was clear, brief, and unflinching. It acknowledged my absence from previous events, and it introduced the foundation with its mission and Walter's words from his final letter to me. I didn't mention Alyssa once. It was never about punishing her. It was about restoring what had been stolen without raising my voice. On the day we filed the public charter, Gregory met me at Walter's grave. He brought a small bouquet of white tulips and read the first paragraph of the mission aloud. His hands trembled slightly. Mine didn't. We left the flowers beside the stone and walked away without speaking. Back home, I sat at my desk and watched as the first donations came in. Small ones at first from names I didn't recognize. Women older, some from out of state. They had seen the early announcement. They had felt something. That night, I brewed a cup of tea and placed the velvet box on the table in front of me. I didn't open it. Not yet. There would be time. Because this story wasn't over. But for the first time in months, I felt it shifting in my hands. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was building. The invitation came printed on thick cards, Stockic ivory with gold trim. At the bottom in bold, it read, "Legacy dinner honoring the life and values of Walter Jennings." It was Alyssa's doing. She had chosen the venue carefully this time. A boutique hotel with a rooftop garden, dimmed chandeliers and glass walls that framed the skyline. The guest list was longer than the one from my birthday. She'd invited executives, media, legacy consultants, and old family friends she hadn't spoken to in years. It was staged to perfection. I arrived precisely 5 minutes before the announced time. Delaney walked beside me in a deep navy coat, her briefcase locked and ready. Gregory followed his expression, unreadable, carrying the now iconic velvet box. The valet took our coats. No one greeted us. Inside, Alyssa stood beneath a floral archway, champagne in hand, lips parted in a smile just wide enough to mask tension. Her eyes flicked to me, then away as if I were part of the backdrop. A photographer raised his lens. I nodded once, not to him, but to what was about to unfold. The dinner began. Small talk floated through the air like perfume. Laughter bubbled from different corners. A pianist played something elegant and forgettable. Midway through the second course, Alyssa tapped her glass lightly. She stood poised and launched into a monologue about legacy, about gratitude, about how families hold stories that shape generations. She made it sound like love. It almost fooled me. Then she gestured toward a small glass pedestal at the front of the room where the velvet box had been placed with care. She said it symbolized closure, connection, and continuity. That was my cue. I stood calm and without ceremony. Delaney stepped forward. Gregory followed. The photographer turned his lens again. I took the microphone. There were no rehearsed greetings, no flowery language, just clarity. I said this wasn't only a dinner to remember Walter. It was the moment we honored the truth he protected. I announced the formation of the Walter and Marjorie Trust for Women in Later Life and explained its purpose to serve women silenced or displaced by those closest to them. Gasps rippled across the room. I didn't pause. I revealed the documentation, the charter, the founding donation. Delaney held it up for the cameras. Gregory stood by the pedestal and gently lifted the velvet box. He handed it to me. I opened it slowly, deliberately, and took out Walter's handwritten letter. The room hushed as I read the first line aloud. Then I stopped. I placed it back inside. The rest wasn't for them. The Trust's website flashed on the screen behind us. Press kits had already been emailed. What had once been a private inheritance had now become a public stand. Alyssa didn't speak. She stood frozen eyes wide, jaw-tight fingers, clutching the edge of the table as though it could hold back the wave rising against her. I looked her way only once, not with anger, but with certainty. This had never been about revenge. This was the quiet, steady reclaiming of space that had always been mine. Afterward, Gregory and I left through the side door. Delaney stayed behind to handle the press. Outside, the sky was deep blue stars, faint behind city haze. I breathed in and exhaled slowly. The box was still in my hands, but now it felt lighter, and for the first time in a long while, so did I. Back home, the night after the dinner, I placed the velvet box on the kitchen table. The air was still. The garden beyond the window was dark save for the pale shapes of Walter's white chrysanthemums glowing faintly under the moonlight. I opened the box again. The envelope I had read from at the dinner was there untouched, but beneath it, tucked under the lining, was a second envelope I hadn't noticed before. It was thinner, sealed in wax, and marked with Walter's handwriting, "Only if she crosses the line." My fingers trembled slightly as I broke the seal. Inside was a single page. The ink had faded just enough to suggest it had been written long ago, but the words remained steady, unmistakably Walter's. He wrote that during his last year, he had discovered something unsettling. Alyssa had used his name to access an old investment account he had never disclosed to the family. She had forged his signature. He knew it had evidence, but chose not to confront her. Instead, he withdrew the remaining funds quietly and closed the account, transferring the balance into a separate trust. He hadn't included this information in the main will. He left it in this letter unspoken, unseen, unless the day came when I needed it. I folded the letter slowly. It was not for court, not for spectacle. It was like Walter exact in its purpose, to guide, not punish. The next morning, I made a quiet call to Delaney. We met in her office just after noon. The walls smelled faintly of cedar and legal paper. She read the letter, her eyes narrowing at the handwriting, then looked at me. Her voice was measured but firm. She said the letter was enough not to sue, but to restructure. Within 2 days, the bylaws of the Walter and Marjorie Trust were revised. Alyssa's name, which had appeared quietly in the second-tier advisory list where she could have influenced future appointments, was removed entirely. Her access to any part of the trust's management was dissolved. The clause added in Walter's honor was simple. Any person proven to have acted in deceit against the founding estate forfeits all future consultation rights. It was elegant, undeniable, and final. I didn't call Alyssa. I didn't need to. The trust's website quietly updated its board structure. The legal statement was filed and archived. No press release followed. No confrontation was necessary. I returned home, brewed tea, and walked out into the garden. Walter's chrysanthemums were in bloom. I knelt to tend to a cluster near the fountain, brushing off a few dry leaves. My knees cracked as I bent a sound I'd grown familiar with, but in that moment I felt grounded. The silence around me wasn't empty. It was peace, earned. Back inside, I placed the letter in the safe behind the pantry next to the original copy of the will. I added a note of my own beside it, brief, handwritten, and dated. Not everything needs to be shouted. Sometimes reclaiming dignity happens in quiet strokes, like pruning a tree, like changing the locks, like rewriting a name out of a future without ever raising your voice. That night, I slept deeply. The box stayed on the nightstand closed, but I knew now it held more than paper. It held the proof that Walter had never doubted me, and finally, neither did I. A month after the trust announcement, I reopened my old counseling space. It wasn't in the same office building downtown. That chapter had closed. I found a small room tucked inside a quiet community center near the edge of the city. Soft lighting, thick carpets, and a large window facing a courtyard of oaks and gravel paths. On the door, a new nameplate, the Quiet Room. It wasn't just symbolic. It was a promise. A space for women mostly older, some recently widowed, some quietly erased from their family stories, to speak without interruption, to sit without judgment, to feel like their pain mattered. I didn't advertise. Word of mouth found its way. My first client was a woman named Deborah, 71, a retired nurse, polite and soft-spoken. Her daughter had moved into her house after losing her job, then gradually stopped, including her in household decisions. When Deborah tried to speak up, the daughter told her she was being ungrateful. Deborah cried when she described sitting alone in her kitchen overhearing a party she wasn't invited to in her own backyard. She asked me how I had learned to stop apologizing for simply existing. I didn't have a perfect answer. I told her I hadn't stopped apologizing overnight, but I had stopped shrinking. That afternoon, we sat in silence longer than we spoke. The next week, she brought a second woman. Then another came. Each story different, but each one carrying the same echo. Mothers turned into burdens. Grandmothers turned into ghosts. Gregory stopped by one day holding a rolled newspaper under his arm. He looked around the room, nodded once, then handed me the paper. The front page of the lifestyle section carried a headline, "A Legacy Reclaimed Widow Launches Foundation for Silenced Women." There was a photo, too, me standing between Gregory and Delaney, smiling just slightly, my hands folded at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. I hadn't known the article was coming. Gregory smiled, but his eyes were tired. He had known Walter longer than anyone still alive. He looked around the room once more and said almost to himself, "This was what Walter would have wanted." I didn't say anything. I just placed the paper on the side table beneath a small vase of chrysanthemums. They were starting to wilt at the edges, but they still stood tall. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I walked out to the garden behind my house. The air smelled like lavender and cut grass. Walter's chrysanthemums lined the path, their white petals fluttering slightly in the breeze. They had bloomed late this year, but they stood tall, quiet, and sure. I sat down on the wooden bench he had built the summer after Alyssa was born. It creaked under my weight, as it always did, like it remembered us. In my lap, I held the tea set, 2 cups, a small teapot, and one of Walter's old cloth napkins folded into a square. I poured the tea slowly, careful not to spill. 1 cup for me, the other I placed beside mine, facing the garden, not for Walter, but for the woman I used to be, the one who swallowed too much silence, the one who nodded even when her chest ached, the one who believed love alone would be enough. I didn't hate Alyssa. I had let go of that weight, but I also no longer carried the hope that she would become someone different. I didn't need her to understand anymore. What I needed, I had already given myself. Peace, clarity, and a voice. The trust would continue. The quiet room would grow. Women would find each other through stories and through stillness. I sipped the tea, slowly watching the light fade. Somewhere inside the house, the clock ticked a soft, steady rhythm. Life wasn't about grand victories anymore. It was about small, deliberate acts of truth. I stayed on the bench until the breeze cooled and the stars began to show. Then I stood, gathered the cups, and walked back inside. The second cup, still full, sat quietly in my hands, and I smiled not at what had been lost, but at what had finally been reclaimed. If you've ever felt like your voice was pushed aside or your story didn't matter, I hope Marjorie's journey reminded you that silence is not the end. Sometimes it's just the beginning of reclaiming your place. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts or share how you found your own strength. Your story matters too.